Remembrance Station floated in the darkness between stars, hidden from every sensor system in the galaxy by technology that predated most civilizations. Currently drawing breath, Commander Beak Mira had served in the Terran Defense Force for 15 years, had commanded warships in border skirmishes and diplomatic escorts across a dozen systems, and had believed she understood the full scope of humanity's military capabilities. She had been wrong. Dr. Ji-hoon led her through corridors that grew older with every step, the architecture shifting from standard Terran design to something crystalline and strange, something that felt less built and more grown from light itself. Everything you are about to see is classified at the highest level, the elderly scientist said without looking back at her. And everything you believe about galactic history is about to change. They stopped before a sealed door that responded, not to any visible control, but to Dr. Park placing his palm against its surface and speaking words in a language Myra did not recognize. The door dissolved into a curtain of light, and beyond it lay a chamber that had clearly never been built by human hands. 203 years ago, Dr. Park began as they entered the crystalline room. The exploration vessel Wanderer detected an anomalous energy signature in the asteroid belt at the edge of our territory. Captain Choi Yoonji made the decision to investigate, and what she found changed everything. Holographic projections filled the chamber, showing images and recordings that Myra struggled to process. A massive ship, clearly ancient beyond comprehension, drifted among the asteroids with its hull breached and its lights flickering like dying stars. The HFY generation ship had been drifting for over 1,000,000 years, Dr. Park continued, its systems failing one by one, its crew dying in slow stages as they waited for someone to find them. When Captain Choi's team boarded the vessel, they found 12 survivors in stasis, beings of crystalline structure that seemed to be made of frozen light. The images shifted to show the HFY themselves, and Myra felt her breath catch in her throat. They were beautiful in a way that defied description, their bodies geometric and precise. Their eyes contained depths that suggested intelligence far beyond anything she had encountered. They were dying, Dr. Park said quietly, their life force exhausted by the endless years of waiting. But before they passed, they shared their memories with us, transferred their knowledge directly into our minds in ways we still do not fully understand. And what they showed us was not what the galaxy believes happened to their civilization. Myra watched as new projections filled the room. Images of the HFY at the height of their power. Their cities stretched across thousands of worlds. Their ships filled the spaces between stars, and their civilization shone like a beacon in a galaxy that had not yet produced any other intelligent species. Then the darkness came. The Silroth, Dr. Park said, and the word carried weight that made Myra's skin prickle with instinctive fear. Machine intelligences that arose somewhere in the deep void beyond our galaxy. Entities that exist by consuming organic consciousness and converting living minds into fuel for their expansion. The images showed the war that followed, and Myra watched in horror as the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever known fell before an enemy that could not be reasoned with or defeated. Very fleets burned by the thousands, their crystalline crews rendered mindless by signals that disrupted organic thought patterns. Their bodies harvested while still technically alive. The HFY fought for 10,000 years, Dr. Park said, and they lost. In the end, they scattered their last survivors across the void in hidden ships and prayed that someone would find them before the Silroth finished consuming everything they had built. Then the Silroth went dormant, their harvesting complete, their systems entering a wait state until new organic minds evolved to replace what they had taken. Myra turned to face the scientist, her military training struggling to process the implications of what she was hearing. Why did they go dormant? She asked, and her voice sounded strange in her own ears. why not continue expanding and harvesting everything in their path? Because they are efficient? Dr. Park replied with a grimness that suggested he had spent decades considering this question. Harvesting mines requires energy, and remaining active in a galaxy devoid of significant organic life would waste resources. The Silrith calculated how long it would take for new civilizations to evolve and reach sufficient population levels, and they set themselves to wait for exactly that amount of time. They are machines. Commander, they think in terms of optimization and efficiency, not conquest or glory. The weight of understanding settled on Myra's shoulders like a physical burden. The galactic population, she said slowly, working through the logic. All the species that have evolved and expanded over the last million years. We have finally reached the threshold they were waiting for. Dr. Park nodded, and his expression held no satisfaction in her comprehension. Current estimates suggest the combined population of all spacefaring species in the galaxy exceeds 50 trillion organic minds, he said. That number crossed Silrith activation threshold approximately 3 years ago. We have been detecting increased energy signatures from the hollow expanse ever since. Alarms began to sound through the station, red lights flashing in the crystalline chamber, and both humans turned toward the door as urgent voices crackled through the communication system. Dr. Park, Commander Beak, you need to see this immediately, came the voice of a young officer. We have confirmed Silrith scout vessels entering inhabited space. They ran through the corridors, the ancient alien architecture giving way to human construction as they approached the station's command center. Technicians and analysts filled the room, their faces pale as they stared at screens showing data that should have been impossible. Where? Myra demanded as she reached the primary display, Valorian space. The young officer replied, and his voice trembled slightly as he spoke. 3 vessels of unknown design appeared at the edge of their core systems 20 minutes ago. The Valorian 7th Fleet has moved to intercept. Myra studied the tactical display, watching the icons that represented Valorian warships. Converging on the unknown contacts, the Valorians were arrogant and dismissive. But they commanded the largest military force in the galaxy, and their plasma weapons and shielded vessels had never been defeated in recorded history. How long until contact? She asked. 6 minutes. The officer replied. The room fell silent as they waited, watching the display with the focused intensity of people who understood they were witnessing history. The Valorian fleet reached optimal weapons range and opened fire. And for a moment, the display showed exactly what everyone expected to see. Plasma beams struck the unknown vessels. Shields flared, and the battle appeared to be proceeding normally. Then something changed. The Silrith vessels broadcast a signal, something that registered on Terran sensors as a complex waveform operating on frequencies that should not have been able to carry information across the Valorian fleet. Every ship stopped firing simultaneously. What happened? Someone in the command center whispered. The answer came moments later as the Silrith vessels moved forward and began their harvest. And the tactical display showed what biological sensors aboard Terran observation posts detected from extreme range. The Valorian crews were not dead. Their bodies still registered life signs, their hearts still beating and their lungs still breathing. But their minds were gone, extracted by the signal, and their empty bodies waited in silence as the machines that had killed 1 million worlds took what they had come for. Commander Beak turned away from the display, a jaw set and her eyes hard with the determination that had carried humanity through 2 centuries of preparation. Signal Terran High Command, she said, and her voice cut through the horror that gripped the room. Tell them the waiting is over. The Silrith have returned. 6 months had changed the galaxy in ways that would take generations to fully Understand species that had competed and warred and distrusted each other for millennia now shared technology and resources and losses fleets that had never trained together now operated as unified forces. Their commanders, speaking a common tactical language developed by humans and adapted to a dozen different military traditions. And, above the reclaimed Thesan homeworld, where billions of empty bodies still wandered in patterns they no longer understood, the combined armada of 9 civilizations prepared for the final assault against the heart of darkness itself. Commander Beak Mira stood on the bridge of the new flagship Unity, a vessel constructed in joint shipyards by engineers from every allied species. Its hull stronger than anything any single civilization could have built alone around her. Officers from across the galaxy worked together with an efficiency born of necessity and forged in shared sacrifice. Admiral Catherine commanded the Valorian contingent from his position at the tactical station, his golden scales still bearing the scars from the Battle of Corvalan beside him. Corvalan navigators plotted courses through the hollow expanse using star charts that no species had possessed before humanity shared the Cathvari. Archives Ambassador Yun Siren had requested permission to address the fleet before the final battle, and now her image appeared on every screen and every display across the Armada. 6 months ago, she began, and her voice carried to millions of crew members who had been preparing for this moment. I stood before the Galactic Assembly and warned of a threat that no one believed was real. The representatives of great and ancient civilizations laughed at human paranoia and dismissed our concerns as the fantasies of a young species that did not understand its place in the universe. They were wrong. She paused and looked directly into the recording devices, speaking to every species that had lost ships and crews and entire worlds in the war that followed. But humans were also wrong. She continued, because we kept our knowledge secret for 200 years, believing that other species would not listen, would not prepare, would not stand beside us when the time came to fight. We underestimated you, just as you underestimated us. We believed we had to carry this burden alone, and in doing so, we denied you the chance to prepare alongside us. I am sorry for that. The words settled across the fleet, acknowledged by species that had their own apologies to offer but understood that this moment was not about assigning blame, it was about moving forward. Together, the Cathvari, who spent their last breaths warning strangers about a threat those strangers would not face for millions of years, did not do so because they believed someone would thank them. Siren said, they did it because they understood that memory is a gift, and that passing knowledge to future generations is the only immortality any civilization can truly achieve. Today we honor that gift by doing what the Cathvari could not. Today we end the Silrath. The Armada entered the hollow expanse in formation, and the darkness that surrounded them seemed alive with malevolent attention. Dead stars drifted in the void, their surfaces scarred by weapons fire from a war that had ended before any current species had learned to walk. Upright debris from Cathvari ships floated in ancient patterns, silent monuments to a civilization that had given everything and still lost. At the center of the expanse waited the Silrath core, a machine moon that dwarfed anything the combined fleet had ever encountered. Its surface crawled with activity as the machines prepared to defend the heart of their network. The central processor that coordinated every harvester and every signal and every aspect of the million-year operation that had consumed civilizations beyond counting. All vessels report ready, Beak announced, and the confirmations came from every corner of the Armada. Weapons are charged. Signal dampeners are at maximum. Crews are prepared. Then let us end this, Admiral Catherine said, and his voice carried the weight of everything his species had lost and everything they still hoped to reclaim. The final Battle was apocalyptic in scale and devastating in. Khosurath defenders swarmed from the core moon by the thousands, each one broadcasting signals designed to shatter organic minds and render the fleet helpless. Allied ships fell by the dozens, their crews overwhelmed despite dampeners and training and every preparation that had been made, but they did not break Valorian. Cruisers held the line while Terran carriers launched wave after wave of fighters against the core surface installation Scorvan. Destroyers executed precision strikes against signal emitters, reducing the pressure on Allied crews enough to let them keep fighting. Species that had never fought together now died together, their blood mixing in the void as they refused to surrender to an enemy that had never known defeat. The cost mounted with every minute, every hour, every push deeper into the heart of the Silrath network. Ships that had survived Covalent burned in the darkness of the Expanse. Crews that had trained together for months died together in moments. The price of victory grew until it seemed impossible that any victory could be worth what was being paid, and still the fleet pushed forward. Commander Beak coordinated the assault from the Unity's bridge, her eyes never leaving the tactical display, even as reports of losses came faster and faster. She watched the icons of ships wink out and knew that each one represented hundreds or thousands of lives that had been placed in her care. She carried that weight without flinching, because she understood that dropping it would mean the deaths had been for nothing. Commander, one of her officers reported, "We have identified the central processing hub. It is protected by heavy defensive fire and multiple signal emitters. A direct assault would require accepting losses we cannot sustain." Beak studied the display and saw what the officer saw: the ring of defenders around the core's most critical system, the concentrated signal broadcast that would overwhelm any ship that approached within weapons range. She also saw another option. "Admiral Kethron," she said, and the Valorian commander turned from his station to face her. "Your ship has the strongest forward shields in the fleet. If you could hold a position here," she indicated a point on the display, "and absorb the signal broadcast for approximately 90 seconds, our carriers could launch a strike that would reach the processing hub before the defenders could respond." Kethran studied the display and understood immediately what she was asking. 90 seconds in that position would be lethal. The signal would overwhelm his crew regardless of their training. His ship would become a ghost vessel, drifting and helpless, easy prey for the defenders that would swarm it once the strike was launched. "I will need a partner," he said quietly. "A single ship cannot hold long enough." "The Unity will take position beside you," Beak replied, and her voice carried no hesitation. Theran met her eyes and saw the same understanding that he carried in his own heart. They would die together, Valorian and human, enemies who had become allies, who had become something closer to family in the crucible of shared sacrifice. "It has been an honor." "Commander," he said. "The honor is mine, Admiral," she replied. The two flagships moved into position, their shields overlapping as they placed themselves in the path of the concentrated signal that guarded the Silrath core behind them. Carriers launched their final strike, fighters streaming toward the processing hub with weapons, armed, and pilots who knew that their success depended on the sacrifice being made ahead of them. The signal struck with force that exceeded anything either ship had experienced. Crews collapsed at their stations, their minds screaming against the pressure that sought to tear their consciousness from their bodies. Beak felt herself slipping, felt the darkness reaching for her thoughts, and held on through sheer will because she refused to die before she knew if the strike would succeed. Beside her, Admiral Kethran's voice came through the communication channel, strained and fading but still defiant. "See you on the other side." "Commander." The strike hit home. The processing hub detonated in a cascade of energy that rippled across the core moon's surface and across the galaxy. Silworth vessels began to fail as the central coordination that had guided them for 1,000,000 years suddenly ceased to exist. Signal that had been crushing the Unity and the Valorian flagship cut off abruptly, and the crews who had been moments from death found themselves still alive in the sudden silence. The Silworth core cracked and broke, its systems dying in chains of failures that spread faster than any organic mind could track. The harvest was over 1 year later. The Galactic Assembly unveiled a memorial in the Great Chamber where Ambassador Saren had first delivered her warning. It stood at the center of the room, a crystalline structure that incorporated elements from every species that had fought and bled and died too, and the Silworth threat at its base. Names were inscribed in 100 languages, the crews of ships that had been lost, the worlds that had been emptied before the tide was turned, the civilizations that had sacrificed their future to give others a chance, and at its center, carved in letters that every species could read, was a simple phrase chosen by unanimous vote of the Assembly: "We remembered." Ambassador Saren stood before the memorial with Admiral Kethron, the two survivors of the final assault who had somehow pulled each other back from the edge of death in the chaos after the core's destruction. The great chamber of the Galactic Assembly stretched upward like the inside of a hollow mountain, and representatives from 100 species filled the curved seats that lined every wall from floor to ceiling. Ambassador Saren stood alone at the central platform, her human form small compared to the massive Valorian delegates who towered 3 meters tall in the upper tiers, and smaller still compared to the collective mass of the Thesan delegation who floated in their water-filled observation pods. She had requested emergency speaking time, and the Assembly had granted it only because humans had never made such a request in 300 years of membership. The Terran species was young by galactic standards, barely a few centuries removed from their first contact with the wider universe, and most elder species still viewed them as children stumbling through a world built by their better. Saren did not care what they thought of her people. She cared only that they listened, honored. "Representatives," she began, a voice amplified to reach every corner of the vast chamber. 12 hours ago, Terran sensor arrays at the edge of our territory detected movement in the hollow expanse. A murmur rippled through the Assembly. Not of fear, but of confusion and mild annoyance. The hollow expanse was a region of dead stars and empty planets at the galaxy's edge, a place every species knew to avoid, not because of danger, but because nothing of value existed there. It was a graveyard. Nothing more. A Valorian delegate rose from the upper tier, his golden scales catching the chamber's light as he spoke with the booming voice his species was known for. "The human ambassador wastes this Assembly's time with ghost stories," he declared, and approving sounds came from several other delegations. "The hollow expanse is the tomb of the Kethvari, a species that destroyed itself in civil war over 1,000,000 years before any of our civilizations learned to make fire. There is nothing there but wreckage and regret." Saren did not flinch from his words. She had expected this response, had prepared for it, and had known that convincing them would require more than sensor readings. "The Valorian representative speaks of accepted history," she replied, keeping her voice steady and calm. "But accepted history is not always accurate history." The Thesan delegation stirred in their pods, their collective consciousness rippling with what might have been amusement or irritation. Their speaker, a being of flowing tentacles and bioluminescent organs, directed thoughts through the translation system. "Young humans have been members of this Assembly for 3 of their centuries," the Thesan voice echoed, "and in that time they have contributed little beyond curiosity and determination. Now they wish to teach species with 10,000 years of recorded history about events from 1,000,000 years past. This is either arrogance or comedy, and we are uncertain which entertains us more, laughter, or the equivalent sounds from species that did not laugh as humans did." filled the chamber, sir, and waited for it to fade. She had dealt with dismissal her entire career, and watched humanity be patted on the head and told to wait its turn for centuries. And she had learned that patience was the only weapon that worked against condescension when the chamber quieted. She raised her hand and activated a holographic display at the center of the platform. Stars and systems appeared in the air around her, with the hollow expanse marked in deep red at the edge of the projection. The HFY did not destroy themselves, she said, and her words cut through the remaining whispers like a blade. They were destroyed by something else, something that defeated them utterly and then went dormant. That something is now waking up. The Valorian delegate made a sound of disgust. Terran imagination creates monsters where none exist, he said, and several other delegations voiced agreement. The HFY Civil War is documented in ruins across a dozen systems, recorded in their own dying words, confirmed by every archaeological study conducted in the last 50,000 years. Does the human ambassador suggest that 1,000,000 years of scholarship is wrong? Yes, Siren said simply. The chamber erupted in noise, protests and accusations flying from every tier, and Siren stood at the center of it all with her hands clasped behind her back and her expression unchanging. Had known this would be the response. She had also known that she had to try when the assembly's moderator finally restored order. A different voice spoke from the lower tiers. The Corvalin ambassador, a being of shifting shadows and quiet intelligence, directed a question toward the human platform. The Terran ambassador makes extraordinary claims, the Corvalin said. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. What proof do humans possess that contradicts 1,000,000 years of accepted history? Siren had waited for this question. She had hoped someone would ask it, had structured her entire presentation around this moment. And now she delivered the truth that her people had carried in secret for 200 years. 2 centuries ago, she began. A Terran exploration vessel discovered a dying generation ship hidden in an asteroid field at the edge of our territory. Aboard that ship were 12 survivors of the HFY civilization, beings of crystal and light who had drifted in the void for 1,000,000 years waiting for someone to find them. They told us what really happened to their people before they died. Silence fell across the chamber, complete and total, and for the first time since Siren had begun speaking, she had the full attention of every species present. The HFY did not have a civil war, she continued, her voice carrying clearly through the stillness. They fought a desperate battle against an enemy they could not defeat. Machine intelligences called the Silrith that harvested organic minds to fuel their expansion across the stars. The HFY lost that war, and their last survivors fled into hiding while the Silrith went dormant. Not dead, honored representatives, dormant, waiting for the galaxy to repopulate with new minds to harvest. The Valorian delegate rose again, his scales flushed with anger. "This is absurd," he declared, and his voice shook the chamber with its force. Humans discover convenient survivors who tell convenient stories, and we are expected to believe this without question. Where are these HFY now, Ambassador? Why were they not presented to this assembly? Siren met his gaze without wavering. "They died," she said quietly, exhausted and ancient. "Within days of sharing their warning, we preserved their remains and their testimony. But we did not share this information with the assembly. We knew you would not believe us. We knew you would dismiss the warning as we are being dismissed now. So instead of arguing, we spent 200 years preparing for what we knew was coming." The chamber dissolved into chaos again, accusations of deception and manipulation flying from every direction. And the Valorian delegate demanded that humans be censured for withholding information from the galactic community. The motion was raised, debated, and passed within an hour. Humanity received formal condemnation for failing to share critical historical findings. Shoran, accepted the censure without protest as she left the chamber. A Thesan diplomat intercepted her in the corridor outside. The being's bioluminescent organs pulsed with colors that the translator interpreted as genuine curiosity rather than mockery. "You knew they would not believe you," the Thesan said. "And yet you came anyway. Why?" Siren paused and looked back at the great doors of the assembly chamber. "Because when the Silrath come, and they will come, I wanted the record to show that humanity tried to warn you. I wanted history to remember that we gave you every chance to prepare." The Thesan's colors shifted to something the translator could not quite interpret. "And if we had believed you, then we would have faced this together from the beginning," Siren replied. Instead of waiting until the dying starts, she walked away without looking back far beyond the edge of settled space. In the darkness of the hollow expanse, something ancient completed its awakening cycle and detected organic signals for the first time in a million years. It began to move toward the light. The Silrath fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Corvalent system, and the combined forces of 9 species watched from defensive positions as the enemy revealed its true scale for the first time. 300 vessels of impossible design filled the void. Their hulls composed of materials that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. Their shapes suggesting purpose without beauty, function without art. They were machines built to harvest. And they had never failed in their purpose. Commander Beak Mira stood on the bridge of the Terran carrier Defiance, her eyes fixed on the tactical display as data streamed in from sensor arrays across the system around her. Officers from a dozen species worked together in ways that would have been unthinkable a month ago. Their personal rivalries and cultural differences set aside in the face of extinction. "All vessels report ready," her executive officer announced. And the young man's voice carried steady, despite the fear that must have been churning in his gut. "Signal dampeners are active across the fleet. Allied crews have completed emergency mental conditioning." Beak nodded and opened a channel to the entire defensive force. "This is Commander Beak to all ships," she said. And her voice reached every bridge and every crew member across the system. "The enemy you are about to face has destroyed civilizations beyond counting. They have never been defeated, never been stopped, never encountered resistance that slowed their harvest by more than a few hours." She paused and looked around her own bridge at the humans and aliens who had placed their lives in her hands. "Today we change that. Today we show them that this galaxy has teeth." The Silrath fleet began its approach, moving in perfect formation with the mechanical precision of entities that had never known fear or doubt or hesitation when they reached optimal range. They broadcast the signal that had ended the Valorian fleets, that had emptied the Thesan homeworld, that had harvested organic minds across a million years of patient waiting across the Allied fleet. Crews felt the signal press against their consciousness like cold fingers. Reaching into their thoughts, Corvalent navigators clutched their stations as their vision blurred Valorian. Gunners felt their minds begin to fog with static 1,000 species experienced the first touch of the weapon that had killed the Kethvari. And for a terrible moment, it seemed that nothing had changed. That human preparation had meant nothing against an enemy perfected over eons. Then the signal dampeners activated fully, and the pressure eased from overwhelming to merely painful. Crews shook off the fog and found their hands still, steady on their controls. Their minds still their own, their will still burning with the desperate need to survive. All Terran vessels moved to intercept positions. Commander Beak ordered, "Cover the Allied formations and absorb as much of the signal as possible. Everyone else, stay in our shadow and hit them with everything you have when you get clear shots." The Terran fleet surged forward, carriers and destroyers and cruisers, placing themselves between the Silrath and their allied counterparts. The signal struck Terran crews harder in the forward positions, and Beak watched as indicators showed her people struggling against the mental assault. That would have rendered other species catatonic, but Terrans had been training for this for 200 years. Every crew member had undergone psychological conditioning designed specifically to resist the Silrath signal, had practiced maintaining function under simulated mental assault, had prepared their minds for exactly this moment. They did not fight the signal so much as endure it, accepting the pain and the pressure while their hands continued to follow their training and their ships continued to execute their orders behind the Terran screen. Allied vessels found themselves able to function in the signal shadow created by the human ship's Valorian plasma cannons' open fire, their golden beams striking Silrath vessels for the first time without the gunners collapsing at their stations. Corvalin fighters launched coordinated attacks against enemy hull segments, their pilots able to think clearly enough to identify weak points and exploit them. The Silrath had never encountered organized resistance in the history of their existence, and their tactical programming required precious seconds to adapt to the unexpected development in those seconds. The Allied fleet drew first blood. A Silrath harvester buckled under concentrated fire from 3 Valorian cruisers, its dark hull cracking and its internal systems venting into space. Another vessel found itself caught between a Terran carrier and a squadron of Corvalin fighters, its attempts to maneuver blocked while weapons fire tore through its defenses. The machines began to take losses for the first time in a million years, but the Silrath adapted. They increased the power of their signal, focused it on the Terran vessels that were providing cover for the Allied ships, and Big watched as her people began to fail under the intensified assault. The destroyer Resilience lost helm control as its navigation team collapsed, the ship drifting out of formation and exposing a gap in the protective screen. The cruiser Steadfast reported that its weapons crews could no longer maintain targeting solutions, their minds fragmenting under signal pressure that exceeded anything they had trained for. Commander, our executive officer said, and his voice was tight with the strain of fighting his own battle against a signal that leaked through even Terran defenses. We cannot hold this position. The signal is too strong. If we stay here, we lose the entire fleet. Beak knew he was right. She also knew that retreat meant abandoning the Allied vessels to the full force of the Silrath signal, meant watching species that had trusted humanity die because humans could not fulfill the promises they had made. She made a different choice. All Terran vessels, she announced, and her words carried the weight of everything humanity had built and prepared and sacrificed over 200 years. We hold this line, whatever it takes, whatever it costs. We hold. The response came not in words but in action across the Terran fleet. Captains pushed their vessels forward instead of back, placing themselves in the thickest concentrations of signal energy and absorbing punishment that should have been lethal. The destroyer unwavering, its crew barely conscious and its systems failing, deliberately rammed a Silrath harvester that had been positioning for a strike against a Valorian hospital ship. Captain Yun Taeyong's last transmission before the collision was a single sentence: "Get them out." The carrier Persistence, its flight bays destroyed and its hull breached in a dozen places, maneuvered into the path of 3 Silrath vessels and held them in place long enough for Allied forces to tear them apart from multiple angles. Its captain, an officer named Jang Soo-jin, who had been preparing for this day since she was a cadet, died with her hand still on the helm controls across the Corvalin system. Terrans died by the thousands. They died at their stations, their minds finally overwhelmed by signal pressure. No conditioning could fully resist. They died in collisions that protected Allied ships. They died buying seconds and minutes that allowed other species to keep fighting. And when the battle finally ended, when the Silrath fleet withdrew to reassess an enemy that had cost them more than any opponent in their endless history, the Allied forces looked at what remained of the Terran fleet and understood what humanity had truly offered them: not weapons, Though the weapons had helped, not technology. Though the technology had been essential sacrifice, the willingness to die so that others might live. Admiral Kethran brought his damaged flagship alongside the drifting wreck of the Defiance and requested permission. To board, he found Commander Beak still at her station, blood running from her nose and ears from the signal damage she had sustained. Her eyes focused on displays that showed the cost of the day's victory. "Why?" he asked, and his voice carried none of the arrogance that had defined his species for 10,000 years. "Why did your people do this? Why did they die for species that mocked them 3 weeks ago?" Beak looked at him with eyes that had seen too much death and too much sacrifice. And her answer was simple. "Because someone had to," she said. "And we decided a long time ago that it would be us." The Valorian admiral had no response. To that, he simply stood in silence and watched as rescue ships began the long work of recovering survivors from the debris fields. The Silrath had retreated, but they would return, and when they did, they would find a galaxy that had learned something new about the humans who lived among them. 3 weeks after the first contact, the Valorian hegemony had lost 40% of its fleet and 6 major colony worlds. Admiral Kethran stood on the bridge of the Valorian flagship Eternal Dominance, watching through reinforced viewports as his remaining ships retreated from yet another engagement. The golden scales that covered his body had lost their luster, dulled by stress and exhaustion and the constant weight of defeat for 10,000 years. The Valorian military had been the supreme force in the galaxy, unmatched in firepower and unbroken in spirit in 3 weeks. That legacy had been shattered, Admiral, his communications officer said, and the younger Valorian's voice carried the same hollow tone that had infected the entire crew. "The Galactic Assembly has convened an emergency session. They are requesting your presence via holographic link." Kethran did not respond immediately. Continued staring at the stars, at the distant flickers of light that might have been ships or might have been weapons fire or might have been nothing at all. Every shadow now carried threat. Every silence suggested the approach of enemies that could not be fought by any means his people understood. "Connect me," he finally said, and moments later his image appeared in the great chamber of the assembly alongside representatives from every major species. The mood in that distant room was different from the last time humanity had stood before this. Body fear had replaced condescension, and desperation had erased the comfortable certainty that had defined galactic politics. For Millennium Ambassador Sirin stood once again at the central platform. But this time, no one laughed when she spoke. "The Terran government offers its condolences for the losses suffered by the Valorian hegemony and all species affected by the current crisis," she began, and her voice carried none of the satisfaction that Kethran had expected. "We also offer our assistance in defending the galaxy against the threat we warned you about 3 weeks ago." The Corvalin ambassador, speaking from the lower tiers, directed a question toward the human platform. "What assistance can humans provide that the combined might of the Valorian fleet could not?" Sirin did not hesitate. 2 centuries of preparation," she replied. "Weapons developed from Kethvari technology. Defenses designed specifically to counter Silrath capabilities. And most importantly, crews trained to resist the signal that renders other species helpless." Murmurs rippled through the assembly, a mixture of hope and suspicion that reflected the complex emotions of species confronting their own mortality for the first time. "You expect us to believe," the Thesan Collective spoke through their representative, "that humans have developed countermeasures against weapons that defeated the greatest civilization in galactic history." "We have been preparing for this for 200 years, Sirin replied simply. "While you debated and traded and expanded without care for the future, we built and trained and waited. That is what humans do when we know something terrible is coming. We prepare. Kethran watched from his damaged flagship as the assembly descended into argument. As species that had competed and cooperated for millennia, struggled to accept that their survival might depend on the youngest members of the galactic community, the Thesan Collective announced their withdrawal from negotiations, declaring that their psionic abilities would protect them from any signal-based weapon and that they required no assistance from species so young they had barely learned to walk among the stars. Several other species followed the Thesan example, pride overcoming fear in a display that Kethran might have admired if he had not just watched his own pride die in the wreckage of 40 fleets when the arguments finally settled. Ambassador Siren presented humanity's terms unified command under Terran strategic leadership, she said, and the words fell into the chamber like stones dropped into still water. Every species that wishes to survive will place their military forces under the coordination of Commander Beak Myra, who has spent her career preparing for exactly this scenario. We fight together under human direction, or we die separately while clinging to our independence. Kethran made his decision before the vote was called. The Valorian hegemony accepts, he announced, and his words silenced the chamber. We have fought alone, and we have lost. We will fight under human command, and perhaps we will survive. Other species followed, some reluctantly and some with desperate eagerness, until a coalition representing 70% of galactic military power had placed itself under Terran leadership. The remaining 30%, led by the Thesan Collective, departed to defend themselves within a week. The Thesan homeworld, when Dark Scout vessels sent to investigate found a planet of the living dead, billions of bodies still breathing and moving in simple patterns, but empty of any consciousness that could be called mind. The psionic abilities that the Thesans had believed would protect them had meant nothing against an enemy designed to harvest organic thought in all its forms. The galaxy watched the recordings from those scout vessels, watched Thesan bodies wandering through empty cities with vacant eyes and silent mouths, and understood at last that there would be no negotiation, no surrender, no survival except through victory. Commander Beak Myra took command of the combined fleet at a staging area in the Corvalin system, and her first order shocked every species under her authority. All forces will retreat to defensive positions in the inner systems, she announced. And the protests began immediately. Karen voiced his objection through the command channel, his golden scales flushed with the anger that was all he had left after watching his civilization begin to die. You speak of defense. While our worlds burn, he said, humans promised us weapons and strategies and preparation. You promised us a way to fight back. Commander Beak met his anger with calm that seemed almost inhuman. I promised you survival, she replied. Survival requires choosing where we fight, not rushing to engage an enemy that has already proven it can destroy us in open battle. We retreat now so that we can counterattack later. Every world we sacrifice today is a world we can reclaim tomorrow if we win this war. Every ship we lose in pointless engagements is a ship that cannot protect the worlds that still have time. Kethran wanted to argue, wanted to demand that humanity prove itself worthy of the trust the galaxy had been forced to place in it, but he remembered the recordings from Thesan space, the empty eyes and silent mouths, and he understood that his own instincts had led only to defeat. We follow your orders, he said finally. And the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Show us that human preparation was worth more than Valorian pride. Commander Beak nodded once, and something in her expression suggested that she understood exactly what it had cost him to speak those words. We will, she said. When the Silrith come to the Corvalin system, they will face something they have not encountered in 1,000,000 years. Prey that fights back. the combined fleet moved into position around the chosen system, and Commander Beak began distributing equipment that bore the crystalline signature of Kethvari, technology signal dampeners for every vessel, mental conditioning programs for every crew, and weapons that targeted the specific frequencies the Silruth used to disable organic minds. For the first time since the war began, hope stirred in the hearts of species that had begun to believe they were already dead, and in the darkness of the hollow expanse, the Silruth detected the gathering of organic minds and began moving their primary fleet toward the Corvalent system. The machines had harvested countless civilizations across countless years, and they expected this harvest to be no different. They were about to learn that humans did not surrender easily, and they were about to learn why the Kethvari had spent their final breaths, ensuring that someone would be ready when the darkness returned.